Before meeting the son of her father's new partner, the spoiled heiress decided to have fun humiliating the new cleaning man. In front of everyone, she pushed him and shouted, "You're useless. You'll never be anything in life." She was laughing when her father, the CEO, entered the room accompanied by a powerful man. With a smile, the father said, "Daughter, I'm glad you're here. I want to introduce you to our special guest." Then, he pointed to the young man she had just humiliated on the floor. The girl's smile vanished, and the look the young man gave her showed that his revenge would be terrible. Julia's office was her kingdom, a stage suspended in the Chicago sky where she was the undisputed star. As the only and thoroughly spoiled daughter of Richard Salles, the CEO of an agribusiness giant, she treated the company headquarters less like a workplace and more like her personal runway. On this particular day, however, the air was thick with a tension that not even the state-of-the-art climate control system could dissipate. Her father was on the verge of closing the most important merger of his career, a strategic alliance with a southern conglomerate led by a reclusive man of traditional values and an unshakable reputation. The key to sealing the deal, to uniting the two fortunes, depended on a single variable: making a good impression on his son, who was due to arrive at any moment for a final evaluation of the company. Richard, his shoulders heavy with responsibility, approached his daughter with a plea in his eyes. "Julia, for the love of God, be nice," he begged, his voice low and tense, almost a whisper. "The young man is on his way. He's different, simple. His father is adamant that his son feels at home, that he sees our values are compatible. Please, treat him well. The future of everything we've built, our entire legacy, depends on this." Julia rolled her eyes with theatrical boredom. In her personal dictionary, a different and simple were euphemisms for broke and irrelevant. The prospect of faking sympathy for some hick from the heartland annoyed her to no end. While awaiting her ordeal, she felt the need for a distraction, a target for her bad mood, and she found it in the silent figure of the new janitor, a quiet young man meticulously polishing the glass floor of the immense lobby, turning it into a dark mirror. With the malice of an actress taking the stage, she orchestrated her little show. She took a false step, a perfectly calculated stumble, and let her ridiculously expensive designer handbag fall to the polished floor, its contents scattering like jewels thrown to swine. The young man, whose name was Michael, stopped his work at once and, with a helpful gesture, knelt to help her gather her things. Her reaction was immediate and cutting. "Don't touch my things with your filthy hands!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the silent lobby, ensuring everyone present could hear. He recoiled, his face flushing, as if her hand were fire. "What's the matter? Forgot how to use your hands? Or is your only purpose in life to crawl on the floor like the worm you are?" To heighten the humiliation, she kicked a luxury lipstick away, sending it sliding across the floor. "Fetch! Come on, little doggy!" As Michael, swallowing his pride and shame, crawled to pick up her belongings one by one, she continued her verbal assault, each word a whip crack. "You're useless. Look at you. You'll never be anything. People like you disgust me." It was at the climax of this cruel scene that the soft chime of the elevator announced an arrival. The brushed steel doors slid open. Her father, Richard, stepped out, accompanied by an older man with graying hair and a serious face that radiated quiet authority. Julia instantly composed her features, a sweet, charming smile appearing on her lips, ready to impress her future business partner. But her smile froze when she saw the look on her father's face. He was pale, his eyes wide with pure horror. Richard wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the humiliating scene. With a trembling hand, he pointed toward the young man on the floor, who was now slowly getting to his feet, his face burning, his dignity in tatters. With a voice choked with the sound of his own empire crumbling, Richard said, "Julia, our guest has arrived. I'd like you to meet—" He paused, breathless, his eyes shifting to the humiliated young man. "Michael Thompson, my new partner's son." Julia's world imploded. The sound around her was replaced by a high-pitched ringing. The simple young man was the heir. The partner, a man whose vast fortune was famously built on pillars of hard work and respect, had seen everything. His expression shifted from shock to a cold, contained, and final fury. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, looked directly at Richard, and uttered a single phrase that sealed everyone's fate. "We're done." Time seemed to stand still. The words, "We're done," spoken with icy calm by Mr. Thompson, hung in the air like a death sentence for the empire Richard had built. For Julia, the ringing in her ears morphed into a deafening silence, a vacuum where the sound of her own inflated ego used to be. She watched, as if in slow motion, as the older man gave Michael's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Michael, who just a moment ago had been useless, now lifted his chin, and in his eyes there was no longer humiliation, but a deep sadness and a reclaimed dignity. Without another word, father and son turned their backs and walked toward the exit, their steady footsteps echoing the finality of their decision. Each step was a nail in the coffin of the biggest deal in the company's history. Julia remained frozen, the forced smile still eerily plastered on her lips, a plaster mask that was beginning to crack. It was the iron grip on her arm that brought her back to reality. Richard was holding her with a force she had never felt, a strength born of desperation and fury. He said nothing. He just pulled her, dragging her across the lobby, past the same employees who had been the audience for her cruel spectacle. Now, their stares were a mixture of shock and poorly disguised satisfaction. The walk to the private elevator felt like an eternity. Inside the box of metal and glass, the silence was a weapon. Richard wouldn't look at her. He kept his face turned to the door, his jaw clenched, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. Julia risked a glance at their reflection in the brushed steel. She saw her father, a man she had always considered a titan, suddenly look old and broken. And she saw herself, her perfect makeup now smudged by a silent tear she hadn't even realized she'd shed. It wasn't a tear of remorse, it was a tear of panic. Her mind, usually so quick to sneer and manipulate, was blank. There was no excuse, no way to downplay what she had done. She had detonated a bomb in the heart of her family's legacy. The elevator ascended to the penthouse, where the lavish CEO's office was located. As soon as the doors closed behind them, Richard let go of her with a shove. He walked to the enormous window that displayed the city like a tapestry of light and concrete, and stood with his back to her, his fists clenched. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice a contained roar. Julia tried to speak, to stammer out a defense, but no sound came out. "Years," he continued, turning to face her, his eyes red with rage. "I spent years building this, negotiating, compromising, planning every single step. That man, Anthony Thompson, built a fortune from nothing based on trust and hard work, values you don't even know the meaning of. And in 5 minutes, with your childish arrogance, you destroyed everything." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Congratulations, Julia. You did it. You annihilated this company's future, our future." He moved closer, his face inches from hers, the scent of disappointment radiating from him. "I gave you everything, the very best of everything. Cars, trips, a position you didn't deserve. I spoiled you, protected you, thought I was giving you the world. But I was wrong. I created a monster." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, a calm that was far more terrifying than screaming. He looked at her, no longer as a father looks at a daughter, but as a judge looks at a defendant. "That ends today. Your life as you know it is over." Her father's words, "Your life as you know it is over," echoed in the oppressive silence of the office. Julia felt the floor disappear from beneath her feet, the vertigo of a free fall. For a moment, a hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. It was an exaggeration, a tactic to scare her. He always caved, he always forgave her. But as she stared into his eyes, cold as chips of ice, she saw not the doting father, but a stranger, a ruthless executive assessing a toxic asset, a liability that needed to be liquidated. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dad, it was a misunderstanding. That man, he was just a janitor. How was I supposed to know?" The excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. Richard walked slowly to his massive mahogany desk, the epicenter of his power, and sat down. He no longer seemed furious. He seemed exhausted, defeated. "No, Julia. The issue was never who he was. The issue is who you are," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You humiliated a human being for sheer sport, and by a twist of fate, that human being was the key to our future. Anthony Thompson didn't build his fortune on speculation or luck. He built an empire based on respect. He wanted to see if our company, if our family, shared those same values before merging his capital with ours." He opened a drawer and pulled out a calculator, a strangely mundane gesture for the magnitude of the disaster. "The news of the cancelled merger will leak before dawn. When the stock market opens tomorrow, our shares will plummet. The investment we were counting on to expand, to cover our debts, it's evaporated. All the money, the wealth you flaunt, is at risk." Julia took a step forward, panic finally breaking through her barrier of arrogance. "We can fix this. I'll apologize. I'll grovel if I have to. I'll go to him. You're not going anywhere." Richard cut her off, his voice like a sheet of steel. He opened another drawer and emptied it onto the desk. It was her credit cards, the unlimited corporate card, the personal ones, whose astronomical bills he paid without blinking. Next to them, he placed his own outstretched hand. "Your cards, the car key. Now." The request was an order. There was no room for negotiation. Her hands trembled so much she could barely open her purse. One by one, she handed over the pieces of colored plastic that defined her existence. Last came the key fob with the emblem of the imported sports car. Each item she placed in his hand was a piece of her identity being ripped away. "The apartment you live in belongs to the company," he continued, impassive, as he put the items away. "You have until the end of the day to collect your personal belongings, only personal belongings." "Where will I go?" Her voice was a thread. Richard looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger shone in his eyes. It was a deep pain, the pain of a surgeon amputating a limb to save the body. "I gave you everything except the one thing that mattered: character. Maybe there's still time to learn." He stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. His decision was already made, forged in the fire of the public humiliation she had put him through. "You will no longer have my money. You will no longer have my name to open doors for you, but I will give you one chance, a single chance, to not end up on the street." He went to a cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a folded piece of clothing. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It wasn't a designer piece. It was a simple gray uniform made of a thick, drab fabric, the same uniform Michael had been wearing. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., the supervisor of the cleaning crew will be waiting for you in the basement. This will be your new position, and your first paycheck won't come for 30 days. Welcome to the real world, daughter." The gray uniform lay on the mahogany coffee table, an alien object in her father's sanctuary of luxury and power. Julia stared at it, and a short, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. The situation was so absurd, so far outside the orbit of her reality, that it had to be an act. A harsh lesson, perhaps, but one with a scheduled end. Her father was testing her. He would scare her, let her feel a drop of despair, and then, once she was suitably repentant, he would forgive her. He always forgave. She raised her eyes from the coarse fabric to his face, searching for the glint of indulgence she always found. The spark that said she was, after all, his little princess. But there was nothing. Richard's eyes were two opaque stones, devoid of any paternal warmth. They were the eyes of a businessman assessing the damage, and she was the red column on the final balance sheet. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice a little louder, denial turning to indignation. "Me, cleaning floors? That's humiliating. I'm your daughter." "It's precisely because you're my daughter that you felt entitled to do what you did," he retorted, his voice glacial. "You used my name, my position, the fortune I built, as a shield for your cruelty. Now that shield is gone." He sat down again, steepling his fingers on the desk as if in a board meeting. "Reputation, Julia, is the primary asset of any business. It's what backs the value of our shares on the stock exchange. And in 5 minutes, you turned our greatest asset into a massive liability. Anthony Thompson was our chance to consolidate our capital, to secure the future. Without his investment, we're vulnerable. Cash flow will be compromised. Our assets are at risk." She shook her head, refusing to understand the cold language of finance. "Money? Is this just about money? You can get more money. You always do." "No." He slammed his hand on the desk, making her flinch. "It's not just about the money. It's about what it represents. Work, respect. My father, your grandfather, started with less than that boy. Michael has today. And he taught me that dignity has no price. A lesson I clearly failed to teach you." He stood up, the final verdict in his eyes. "This is decided. Your time as a princess is over." He pointed to the door. "Get your personal things from your old office and leave. Security will escort you to the front door of the building." Defeated, humiliated, Julia walked out of the executive suite. The world she knew was crumbling with every step. Her father's secretary, who always greeted her with a subservient smile, now looked at her with undisguised pity. In the hallway, employees averted their gazes, pretending to be busy, but she could feel the whispers and sidelong glances. It was a walk of shame. Inside the elevator, next to an impassive security guard, she looked at herself in the mirror. The image staring back was a stranger, a pale face, wide with panic. The designer clothes suddenly feeling like a grotesque costume. At the main entrance, the outside world hit her like a slap. The noise of the city, the rushing people. She, who always exited through the private garage, was now on the sidewalk like any other mortal. She reached for her phone to call her driver, then remembered he was paid by the company. Her car was gone. With trembling hands, she opened a ride-sharing app. Arriving in front of her luxury high-rise, a final spark of hope ignited. This was her sanctuary. Here, nothing could touch her. But Carlos, the doorman who always opened the door for her with a bow, blocked her entrance, his face contorted with discomfort. "Miss Sally's. I'm so sorry," he stammered, unable to meet her eyes. "I have express orders from Mr. Salles. Your access to the building has been revoked." "Revoked." Julia repeated the word, the sound foreign and metallic in her own ears. The word didn't fit in her universe. Doors opened for her, access was granted. The idea of being barred from her own home was as inconceivable as the sun rising in the west. She looked at Carlos, the doorman, expecting him to laugh and say it was a bad joke, but the man's face was a mask of professional pity and embarrassment. He held a clipboard, the instrument of his newly imposed authority, like a shield. "Those are the orders, miss," he said in a low voice. "Mr. Salles called personally. You are only permitted entry to retrieve your belongings. A company employee will escort you." At that moment, a man in a grey suit, whom Julia vaguely recognized from the company's security department, emerged from the lobby and stood beside Carlos, confirming the sentence with a nod. Reality hit her with the force of an icy wave. This wasn't a test. It wasn't a fleeting lesson. It was an exile. The humiliation she had felt in her father's office was merely a prelude. This, in front of the building that bore her address, under the curious gazes of passing neighbors, was the true fall from grace. Accompanied by the silent security guard, she rode the elevator that had so often carried her to her duplex penthouse. The apartment, once a symbol of her independence and status, now felt like a mausoleum. The designer furniture, the works of art, the Persian rugs, none of it was hers. It was just scenery from a life that no longer belonged to her. The guard handed her some cardboard boxes. "Mr. Sal's was clear," he said in a neutral voice. "Only clothes, shoes, jewelry, and strictly personal items." Julia walked through her closet, a room the size of a small apartment, and felt a wave of nausea. The rows of designer shoes, the handbags worth more than a small car, the dresses she had worn only once. They were her armor, the symbols of her power. Now they were just useless junk. What would she do with a ball gown when her next engagement was with a mop? With impotent rage, she began throwing things into the boxes: clothes, perfumes, photographs. Each object was a memory of a past that was dissolving by the minute. The process was swift and brutal, an amputation of her own history. 2 hours later, she was back on the sidewalk with 4 cardboard boxes and a small carry-on containing her jewelry. The security guard left her there and went back inside the building, his mission accomplished. Julia looked up and down the street. The city, which had always been at her feet, now seemed like a threatening labyrinth. The sun was beginning to set, staining the sky orange and purple, a cruel beauty that mocked her misery. She had nowhere to go. Her friends were friends of her status, of her money. None of them would take her in as a pariah. Her mother had moved to Europe after the divorce, living off a generous alimony from Richard. Calling her would mean admitting defeat, and Julia's pride, though wounded, was the only thing she had left. With the little cash she had in her wallet, she hailed a cab. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked. She hesitated. There was only one place, a place she had avoided for years, a relic of a past that didn't fit into her life of luxury, the home of her Aunt Lydia, her mother's sister, a retired teacher living in a modest neighborhood on the other side of the city, a place with no glamour, no doormen, no luxury, a place where she would have to face not just the loss of her fortune, but the loss of herself. As the cab crossed the city, Julia stared out the window. The wealthy neighborhoods, with their imposing buildings and manicured lawns, gave way to narrower streets, smaller houses, a reality she had only ever seen through the tinted windows of her imported car. It was like crossing a border into a foreign country. When the cab stopped in front of a small house with an iron gate and a little front garden, Julia's heart sank. This was it, the bottom of her fall, the beginning of her exile. She paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by her boxes, staring at the lit window of the house. She hadn't seen her aunt in almost 5 years. How would she be received? With pity? With an "I told you so"? With a trembling hand, she raised her finger and pressed the doorbell, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet night and announcing the arrival of the deposed queen to her new, unwelcome kingdom. The door opened with a gentle creak, revealing a woman with grey hair pulled into a loose bun, and a face marked by kind wrinkles that deepened around her eyes and mouth. Aunt Lydia stared at her for a long moment, the initial surprise giving way to an expression of understanding and sadness. There were no questions, no accusations, just a tired sigh, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. "Come in, Julia," she said simply, opening the door wider and stepping aside. The inside of the house was exactly as Julia remembered from her rare, obligatory visits as a child, small, impeccably clean, and with a comforting smell of cornbread and floor wax. Old, dark wood furniture polished with care, a sofa covered with a crocheted blanket, and dusty photo frames scattered on every surface. It was the absolute opposite of her minimalist, aseptic apartment. It was a home. Lydia helped her carry the boxes inside, placing them in a corner of the small living room. "Are you hungry? I just made some coffee." Without waiting for an answer, she headed to the kitchen. Julia followed, feeling clumsy and too large for the space. She sat at the kitchen table, covered with a colorful checkered tablecloth, while her aunt moved with quiet efficiency, placing an enamel mug and a slice of cake on a plate in front of her. The silence was heavy, filled only by the ticking of a rooster-shaped wall clock. Julia, who was used to filling any silence with her own voice, didn't know what to say. The words of mockery and command that formed her usual vocabulary were useless here. "Your father called me," Lydia said finally, sitting down across from her with her own cup of coffee. "He's devastated." Julia took a bite of the cake. The taste was sweet and familiar, an anchor in the whirlwind of her despair. "He hates me," she mumbled, her voice thick. Lydia shook her head slowly. "Richard doesn't hate you, child. He's heartbroken and he's scared. He gave you a world of material wealth, of assets and possessions, but he forgot to prepare you for the only liability that truly matters, real life." She reached across the table and touched Julia's arm. The touch was warm and firm. "What you did was terrible. A boundless cruelty to that young man. But your father's punishment, it's an act of desperate love. He's trying to save your soul, not just the family fortune." Julia wanted to scream. She wanted to say she didn't need her soul saved, that she wanted her apartment, her car, her money back. But the words died in her throat. The emotional and physical exhaustion overwhelmed her, and for the first time since her world had collapsed, she cried. Not tears of anger or panic, but deep, convulsive sobs of a lost child. Lydia let her cry, patting her arm in silence until the sobs subsided. Then she stood up. "You can stay in the guest room. It's small, but the bed is clean." She led her down a narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the house. There was a twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small window that looked out onto a backyard with a large oak tree. "Tomorrow is a new day," Lydia said from the doorway. "Your father said you have a new job at 6 in the morning. The bus that passes on the corner will drop you off 2 blocks from the building." She paused. "The alarm clock is on the dresser. Don't be late for your first day." The door closed softly, leaving Julia alone in the dim light. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under her weight. She looked at the grey uniform, which her aunt had placed, folded on the chair. It looked like a shroud. The smell of mothballs in the room was suffocating. The distance between the luxury penthouse and this small room was greater than the miles the cab had traveled. It was the distance between a life of privilege and the harsh reality of work. She lay down on the bed, still in her designer clothes, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was a carousel of images. Michael's humiliated face, her father's look of contempt, the grey uniform. For the first time in her life, Julia was afraid. Not the fear of losing a deal or having a credit card declined, but a deep, existential fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of being, as she herself had called Michael, nothing. The sharp, insistent ringing of the alarm clock at 5 in the morning sounded like an air raid siren, heralding the start of her new and terrible reality. The pre-dawn Chicago cold seeped into Julia's bones as she waited at the dark bus stop. The grey uniform, made of a rough, scratchy fabric, offered no protection against the biting wind. It was the first time in her adult life she had stood on a sidewalk before sunrise, surrounded by strangers whose tired, resigned faces reflected a reality she had never known. They were the faces of the working class, the invisible people who kept the city running while she slept on Egyptian cotton sheets. When the bus arrived, crowded and noisy, she boarded hesitantly. feeling dozens of eyes on her. Her designer flats and leather handbag, the last vestiges of her old life she hadn't had the heart to leave behind, marked her as an outsider. She clung to a metal pole, stumbling with every turn as the vehicle lurched through the streets. The smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and stale coffee was suffocating. The journey, which in her chauffeured car would have been a quick and comfortable ride, felt like an endless and humiliating ordeal. When she got off 2 blocks from the imposing Sal's Enterprises building, she felt like an imposter. The mirrored glass facade, which once reflected her success, now seemed to mock her downfall. She entered through the back, the service entrance, a path she never knew existed. The basement was a labyrinth of pipes, storage rooms, and poorly lit corridors with a strong smell of cleaning chemicals. A short, heavy-set man in stained overalls and a stern face was waiting for her. "You must be Julia," he said without preamble. His name tag identified him as Gerald, facilities supervisor. "Thought it was a joke when Mr. Sal's called me, but he said to treat you like any other employee. No special treatment." "Understood." Julia just nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Gerald led her to a small locker room and handed her a pair of rubber gloves, a bucket, and a mop. "Your section today is the 5th floor, bathrooms and the break room. I want everything sparkling by lunchtime. After that, you'll help Maria with the office cleaning, and don't even think about using the main elevators. The service elevator is at the end of the hall." The 5th floor was the finance department's territory, the place where decisions were made about investments, profits, and dividends that sustained her lifestyle. Now, she was on her knees, scrubbing the floor of the men's restroom, the smell of disinfectant stinging her eyes. The first employees began to arrive, men in suits who, just a week ago, would have stood up when she entered a room. Now, they either ignored her or, worse, shot her glances of curiosity and contempt. One of them, a young analyst she remembered humiliating in a meeting, dropped a paperclip on the floor near her and said loudly to a colleague, "Wow, the cleaning service is really going above and beyond today." Their laughter was like a slap in the face. Every tile she cleaned, every trash can she emptied, was a lesson in humility. The work was physically exhausting. Her muscles, accustomed only to Pilates classes, protested. Her hands, always impeccably manicured, grew red and raw inside the rubber gloves. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental agony. She was a circus attraction, the fallen princess on public display. At lunchtime, she sat alone in the employee cafeteria, a noisy, drab room in the basement. No one spoke to her. She ate the simple, tasteless food and felt the knot in her stomach tighten. That's when she heard the name Thompson from a conversation at the next table. 3 secretaries were talking in low voices. "I heard the cancelled merger was a disaster," one said. "The stock plummeted this morning. They're talking about massive layoffs." "It's the boss's daughter's fault, right?" said another. "I heard she humiliated the guy's son, that Michael Thompson, in front of everyone." The third woman, older, shook her head. "Poor kid. They say he's a good guy. Works on the farm side by side with the employees. Not like these people born with a silver spoon who think the world owes them something." The fork fell from Julia's hand. So, it was true. Her actions hadn't just destroyed herself and her father. They were destroying the livelihoods of hundreds of families. The wealth she had squandered was built on the work of these people who might now lose their jobs because of her arrogance. For the first time, the weight of her actions began to sink in. This wasn't just about a lost deal. It was about lives. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. She worked silently, mechanically, her head throbbing with the new information. When her shift ended, she was exhausted, filthy, and felt like the lowest creature on earth. As she walked out the service entrance, dusk was coloring the sky, and that's when she saw him. Across the street, leaning against a simple pickup truck, was Michael Thompson. He wasn't waiting for her. He seemed to be just watching the traffic, his face pensive. But when their eyes met, Julia's world stopped. He saw her. Not the arrogant heiress, but the janitor in the grey uniform with disheveled hair and a soul in tatters. He didn't smile, didn't sneer. He just held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw something that terrified her more than contempt. It was pity. Time froze in the instant their gazes locked across the grey asphalt. For Julia, the world shrank to that space, the distance between the fallen queen in her servant's uniform and the pawn she had tried to crush. The pity in Michael's eyes was a mirror reflecting not just her current state, but the ugliness of her past actions. It was a silent condemnation, more powerful than any shout or insult. She felt a primal urge to flee, to hide in the shadows, to become invisible so he could not witness the depths of her fall. Her body tensed, bracing for the inevitable confrontation, for the mockery she deserved, for the words he had every right to throw at her. But then, something unexpected happened. Michael looked away, not with disdain but with decision, and he started to cross the street. Julia's heart hammered against her ribs, a dull thud of panic. This was it. He was coming for her. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, steeling herself for the impact. However, when she opened them, she realized he wasn't walking toward her. His path was different. He was heading, with calm, steady steps, toward the main entrance of the building, the same revolving door of glass and steel she was now forbidden to use. Confusion paralyzed her. What was he doing? And then, as if in a scene staged by a cruel fate, the revolving door expelled the figure of her father. Richard looked like he had aged 10 years in 24 hours. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and lined with worry. He stopped short upon seeing Michael, surprise written all over his face. The two men stared at each other for a moment, the wounded titan of industry and the young heir from the country. Instinctively, Julia shrank back into the shadows of an alcove near the service door, her heart in her throat. She couldn't be seen. She had to listen. The voices were low, but the evening quiet allowed fragments of their conversation to reach her, words that would redefine her future. "My father has reconsidered," Michael was saying, his voice surprisingly calm and steady, without a trace of anger. He admired your actions. Your decision." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Admired? He cancelled the biggest deal of my life. Our company is bleeding out on the stock market. The problem was never your capital, Mr. Sally's. The problem was the succession, the legacy," Michael explained. "My father needs to know that the future of the combined company would be in hands that value work, not just profit. And what you did with your daughter, it showed him that your values, deep down, are strong." There was a tense pause. Julia held her breath. "So, what do you want?" Richard asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "It's not a proposal, it's a condition," Michael said, and the words that followed struck Julia like lightning. "The merger can be renegotiated, the investment can be back on the table, but there's a test. A probationary period." "What kind of test?" Her father's voice was a whisper. Julia leaned forward, her body trembling. Your daughter," Michael said, and Julia's world stopped spinning. "She stays exactly where she is. No help, no privileges. If, in 6 months, she proves she can understand the value of a hard day's work, that she can treat every employee, from the janitor to the director, with the same respect. My father believes character can be forged. If she succeeds, our family fortunes will be joined. If she fails, the door closes for good." Julia leaned against the cold wall, her legs weak. This wasn't a punishment. It was a trial, a purgatory with $1 billion prize at the end. The future of everything she had ever known, the wealth, the business, the jobs of hundreds of people, no longer depended on her father. It depended on her. Her humiliating journey suddenly had a purpose, and the key to her redemption, or her eternal damnation, was in the hands of the man she had tried to destroy. In the days that followed the revelation, Julia's world became a stage for silent observation. Every swipe of the mop, every trash can emptied, every good morning, she murmured to a co-worker, was part of a performance whose only important spectator was one she rarely saw. Michael didn't appear at the building often, but his presence was constant, a shadow that loomed over her every action. The condition imposed by him and his father was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered an unlikely path back to her old life. On the other, the pressure was crushing. It was no longer about just surviving day to day, but about acting out the play of redemption with an authenticity she wasn't sure she possessed. The work itself was a brutal teacher. Her days began in darkness and ended in exhaustion. The monotony of the tasks forced her to confront her own thoughts. As she scrubbed the granite lobby floor, the very floor where her life had imploded, she had time to think about the secretary's conversation, the potential layoffs, the ripple effect of her actions. The arrogance that once defined her began to be eroded by exhaustion and a growing sense of shame. Her interactions with other employees were hesitant. At first, she was treated with a mixture of hostility and morbid curiosity. She was the castle princess forced to clean the latrines, an amusing spectacle for some. But as days turned into weeks, the novelty wore off. They began to see her not as the boss's daughter, but as the woman who cleaned the bathroom next door, who ate alone in the cafeteria, who looked just as tired as they did at the end of the day. A fellow cleaner, Maria, an older woman with calloused hands and an easy smile, was the first to break the ice. She saw Julia struggling with a heavy floor buffer and, without a word, walked over and adjusted a lever. "There's a trick to it, otherwise you'll throw out your back," she said, her voice gentle. Julia, surprised, just mumbled a "thank you." That small gesture of kindness, from someone who owed her nothing, disarmed her. From that day on, Maria started sharing her lunch with her, giving her tips on how to remove tough stains, talking about her kids and grandkids. Through Maria, Julia began to see the invisible world that had always served her. She heard about the struggles to pay rent, the dreams of giving their children a better education, the small joys that illuminated their difficult lives. These people were not the worms she had imagined. They were complex, resilient human beings whose lives were far richer in character than hers had ever been. Her relationship with her Aunt Lydia also deepened. In the evenings, too exhausted to do anything but eat the simple meal her aunt prepared, Julia found herself talking. She told her about her day, the aches in her body, the humiliation of being ignored. Lydia listened patiently, without judgment, offering a piece of practical advice here, a word of comfort there. She didn't coddle her, but she offered a safe harbor, a place where she could let her guard down and be vulnerable. One particularly difficult evening, after being reprimanded by Gerald for not cleaning a conference room on time, Julia broke down. "I don't know if I can do this, Auntie. It's so demeaning." Lydia stopped her knitting and looked at her over her glasses. "Demeaning, Julia, is treating people as if they are beneath you. There is nothing demeaning about honest work. The question you need to ask yourself isn't if you can do this. It's who you want to become at the end of it." The question hit her hard. At first, the goal had been clear. Endure 6 months, win back the fortune, return to her life. But now, slowly, the lines were blurring. She saw the dignity in Maria's fatigue, the simple wisdom of her aunt, and she wondered if the life she so desperately wanted back was, in fact, a life worth living. At the end of her first month of work, she received her first paycheck. The brown envelope contained a sum that, previously, she would have spent on a single pair of shoes without a second thought. Now, that money felt like a fortune, every dollar earned with sweat and an aching back. That night, for the first time, she contributed to the household expenses. leaving a few bills on the kitchen table for her aunt. It was the first time she had felt the weight and value of money. It was the first step in a transformation she didn't yet understand, a journey that was just beginning, under the watchful, distant gaze of the man who had become, against all odds, the architect of her destiny. The second month brought a new routine, and with it, new challenges. The raw humiliation of the first few days gave way to a weary resignation. Julia was no longer an exotic novelty in the company's basement. She had become part of the furniture, a silent presence in a grey uniform who moved through the hallways before dawn. Her body had grown accustomed to the ache. Her muscles no longer protested so vehemently. The biggest challenge now was not physical, but internal. It was the fight against invisibility. Being ignored was, in some ways, worse than being the target of mockery. She, who had lived at the center of all attention, now walked past directors and managers who didn't even look up. It was as if the uniform erased her, rendering her a non-person. This invisibility, however, gave her a new perspective. She became an observer. From the corners she cleaned, she saw the inner workings of the company in a way she never had from her executive suite. She saw the tension on the analysts' faces before a big presentation, heard the whispers about stock market rumors, felt the collective anxiety when quarterly results were announced. She began to understand that her father's empire wasn't just about numbers and strategies, but about the people who held it up. One afternoon, while cleaning the break room on the executive floor, she heard her father's voice coming from the boardroom. He was on the phone, his voice tense and low. I know. The liabilities are high. The stock drop left us exposed. If we can't secure a new cash flow soon, we'll have to start liquidating some assets. Julia froze, a cleaning rag in her hand. She knew what liquidating assets meant. It meant selling off parts of the company. It meant layoffs. The weight of her guilt, which had become a constant burden, grew even heavier. She was the cause of this crisis. Her arrogance had jeopardized not only her family's legacy, but thousands of livelihoods. The conversation shook her to her core. That night, in her aunt's small kitchen, she barely touched her food. Lydia, sensing her distress, sat down beside her. What is it, my dear? Julia hesitated, but the need to unburden herself was greater than her pride. I heard my dad, the company, it's in trouble, serious trouble, because of me. She buried her face in her hands. I destroyed everything, Auntie, everything my grandfather built, everything my father worked for. Lydia was silent for a moment, then said with her usual calm, You made a terrible mistake, Julia. But drowning in guilt won't fix anything. Guilt is a dead weight. Remorse, on the other hand, can be an engine. The question is, what are you going to do with that remorse? The question echoed in Julia's mind over the following days. What could she do? She was a janitor. She had no power, no voice, no influence. Yet, her aunt's question ignited a small flame of her old personality, the proactivity, the refusal to accept defeat. She started paying closer attention, listening more carefully. In the break rooms, in the hallways, while emptying office trash cans at night, she collected information, small details, fragments of conversations. She heard about a logistics contract that was generating unnecessary costs, about a grain supplier that was consistently delivering lower quality product affecting profitability. These were problems that, from her old position, she would never have known about. Her mind, once occupied with fashion and gossip, began to work in a new way. She started connecting the dots, seeing patterns. The superficial knowledge of the family business she had absorbed through osmosis, over dinners and casual conversations, began to merge with what she saw and heard every day. One night, she couldn't sleep. She got up and, at the kitchen table with a cheap notebook and a pencil, she began to write. She drew flowcharts, listed problems and potential solutions. She wrote about renegotiating the logistics contract, about auditing the grain supplier. It was a rudimentary plan, born from the unique perspective she now possessed. The view from the ground floor. She didn't know who to show it to. Certainly not her father. He had banished her from his world, but the need to do something, to try and repair the damage she had caused, was overwhelming. It was a desperate attempt to turn her remorse into action, and, unbeknownst to her, her progress was not going unnoticed. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she saw Michael again. This time, he wasn't across the street. He was standing near the service exit, chatting amiably with Maria, her fellow cleaner. He was laughing at something she said, his face open and genuine. When he saw Julia, he didn't look away. He just gave a slight nod, a simple, almost imperceptible gesture. But there was no pity in his eyes this time. There was something else. Curiosity, maybe even a flicker of respect. Michael's nod was a small crack in Julia's armor of invisibility. It was the first acknowledgement, however minor, that she was more than a grey uniform. The gesture, devoid of pity or mockery, haunted her. He was watching, evaluating. The fact that he was talking to Maria proved he wasn't just interested in her performance as a janitor, but perhaps in her interactions with others, her capacity for human connection. The realization that her test was far more complex than simply completing her tasks filled her with a new anxiety, but also a strange determination. She wasn't just cleaning floors, she was trying to scrub her character clean in his eyes. The notebook with her observations became her secret and her sanctuary. Every night, under the dim light of the living room lamp, she added new entries. She noted the waste of office supplies, the recurring complaints about the slow IT system, the low morale in certain departments. These were problems the top executives, isolated in their panoramic view offices, likely knew nothing about. She was mapping the diseased arteries and veins of the corporate body. One afternoon, while cleaning the office of a logistics manager, she found a preliminary report on transportation costs in the trash. The document was crumpled, discarded. Driven by an impulse, she smoothed it out and tucked it into her uniform pocket. Later, at home, she compared the numbers in the report with her own observations about the delivery routes she'd heard drivers discuss. There was a clear discrepancy. The company was paying for longer, inefficient routes, likely due to an old, unreviewed contract. The discovery electrified her. It was something concrete, a real problem with a tangible solution. The remorse that consumed her began to transform into a sense of purpose. She wasn't just trying to save herself. She was trying to save the company that was her family's legacy. The challenge was how to get this information to the right people. Handing a crumpled, handwritten business plan to her father was unthinkable. She needed a channel, someone who could listen without prejudice. And as terrifying as the idea was, only one name came to mind: Michael. The opportunity arose unexpectedly. Gerald, her supervisor, fell ill, and she was tasked with taking some documents to the Thompson family farm, where a meeting between the agricultural managers of both companies was taking place. It was a simple messenger's errand, but it took her into the heart of enemy territory. The farm was immense, a green carpet of crops stretching to the horizon. It was a place of real work, smelling of damp earth and the sound of farm machinery. It was the source of the Thompson fortune, a wealth born from the soil, not from speculation. She delivered the documents and was about to head back to the company car when she ran right into him. Michael was coming out of a barn, his boots caked in mud, his flannel shirt stained with grease. He looked surprised to see her there. "Julia, what are you doing here?" "I brought some documents for the meeting," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. Her heart was pounding. It was now or never. "Michael, can I talk to you for a minute? It's important." He eyed her suspiciously, but his expression was more curious than hostile. "Sure, let's walk." They walked in silence down a dirt road that wound between the fields. The air was clean, the sun warm. It was a world away from the sterile, climate-controlled office environment. Julia took a deep breath, mustering all her courage. "I know you probably think I'm the most shallow, selfish person in the world. And you were right, I was—" she began, the words tumbling out. "But being down there on the ground floor, it's made me see things nobody in the executive suite sees. My father's company is bleeding from the inside. Small cuts, waste, inefficiencies that together are causing a hemorrhage." She stopped and faced him, her eyes pleading. "I know how to stop some of the bleeding. I've been taking notes, ideas." Michael stopped walking and turned to her. His face serious. He said nothing, just waited. With trembling hands, she pulled the worn, folded notebook from her pocket. The cover was stained with coffee, the pages crumpled. It was the testament of her transformation. She held it out to him. "Please, just read it. Not for me, for the company, for the jobs that are on the line." He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze scanning her face, as if trying to decipher the truth behind her words. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the notebook. The brush of his fingers against hers was brief, but electric. He didn't open it, he just held it, weighing it in his hand. "I'll read it," he said, his voice neutral. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone on the dirt road, her heart racing, and the fate of her world contained in those crumpled pages. The weight was torture. The days that followed her handing over the notebook were the longest of Julia's life. Each work shift was an exercise in self-control, a struggle to focus on cleaning bathrooms and break rooms while her mind revolved around a single question: would he believe her? Michael's silence was an abyss. She had no way of knowing if he had even opened the notebook. Maybe he had thrown it in the trash, dismissing it as the ravings of a desperate heiress. Or worse, maybe he was using it to mock her with his father. The uncertainty gnawed at her, leading to sleepless nights in the small room at her aunt's house. During the day, she tried to cling to her routine. She continued her conversations with Maria, learning more about her life, her struggles, her joys. She helped Carlos, the mailroom clerk, organize the cleaning supply inventory, creating a simple system that saved time and prevented waste. Small actions, insignificant to the old Julia, but which now gave her a sense of purpose, a way to exert some control over her small universe. One of these afternoons, while polishing the metal handrail of the service stairs, she heard hurried footsteps. It was her father. Richard was coming down the stairs, something he never did, always preferring his private elevator. He didn't see her, tucked away on the landing. His face was grey, his expression grim. He was talking on his cell phone, his voice an urgent whisper. "No, we can't wait any longer. The offer from the investment fund is the only way out. They want 51% of the stock. I know it means losing control, but it's that or bankruptcy. We sign tomorrow." Julia's world collapsed for a second time, losing control. The company her grandfather had founded, that her father had sacrificed so much to grow, would be handed over to an investment fund, financial vultures known for buying struggling companies, carving them up, and selling the pieces for a quick profit. It would mean massive layoffs, the end of her family's legacy, and it was all her fault. If she hadn't been so blinded by arrogance, none of this would be happening. She shrank back on the stairs, tears silently streaming down her face, mingling with the smell of metal polish. It was over. Her effort, her notes, her tenuous hope for redemption, all for nothing. She was too late. That night, she couldn't face Aunt Lydia. She just mumbled that she had a headache and locked herself in her room. She lay on the bed and cried until she had no tears left. Sleep was a fitful refuge, haunted by nightmares of her father handing the keys to the company over to faceless men. The next day dawned grey and rainy, a perfect reflection of her mood. She dragged herself to work, her body feeling as heavy as lead. The thought of spending another day cleaning the building that would soon no longer belong to her family was unbearable. She was in the locker room, pulling on her uniform, when her phone, a simple model her aunt had given her, vibrated. It was an unknown number. She answered, her voice hoarse. "Hello? Be at the service entrance in 5 minutes, and don't put on the uniform." The voice was unmistakable. It was Michael. The call ended before she could reply. A whirlwind of emotions hit her. Fear, confusion, a spark of hope so fragile she barely dared to acknowledge it. What did he want? Why now? Trembling, she took off the uniform and put back on the simple clothes she had arrived in. 5 minutes later, she was at the back door, the fine rain dampening her hair. A black sedan, different from the pickup truck she had seen him drive, pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Michael behind the wheel. Get in," he said, his voice serious, leaving no room for questions. She got into the car, the leather interior smelling new. He didn't say where they were going. He just drove in silence, navigating the morning traffic with a calm that contrasted with the storm inside her. He pulled up in front of a modern office building in a part of the city she didn't recognize. "Come with me." He led her through a sleek lobby to an elevator. They rode up in silence. The doors opened onto a floor occupied by a single office. A glass plaque on the wall read, "Thompson Capital, Investments and Holdings." His father, Anthony Thompson, was sitting behind a massive wooden desk, his face impassive. And standing beside him, with the expression of a man caught in an ambush, was her father, Richard. Richard stared at her, shock and confusion on his face. "Julia, what is she doing here?" Anthony Thompson ignored the question. He gestured to the empty chair in front of his desk. The gesture wasn't for Richard, it was for her. "Sit down, Miss Sallis," the old man said, his voice as deep as thunder. "My son tells me you have some ideas on how to save a company." The air in the room was so thick, Julia struggled to breathe. Sitting in that chair, under the piercing gaze of Anthony Thompson and the astonished expression of her own father, felt like the most surreal thing that had ever happened to her. She glanced at Michael, who stood silently by the window, his face unreadable. He had thrown her into the lion's den, and she had no choice but to face them. I, she stammered, her voice failing. Anthony's gaze was like an X-ray, seeming to peer into her soul, to weigh her intentions. Richard, still standing, looked like a ghost, completely lost. "What's going on here, Anthony?" he asked, his voice tight. "We were about to sign with the fund." "You're not signing anything," Thompson said sharply, his eyes never leaving Julia. "Not until I hear what this young woman has to say. Michael showed me your notes. Rudimentary, simplistic, but with a perspective that you suits lost a long time ago. The one from the ground up. So, speak, girl. Convince me. Why should I invest my money in the business of a man whose own daughter brought it to the brink of ruin?" The question was a slap, cruel, direct, but it ignited a spark inside Julia. Her old combativeness, the same fire she had once used for arrogance, now re-emerged in service of a greater purpose. She took a deep breath, remembering the sleepless nights, the conversations with Maria, the desperate sound of her father's voice on the stairs. She had nothing left to lose. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice gaining strength, "you wouldn't be investing in one man's business. You'd be investing in the thousands of employees who depend on it. People who, despite the crisis, continue to work hard every single day." She turned to her father, who was looking at her as if he'd never seen her before. "Dad, the logistics contract with Translog, it was signed 10 years ago. The routes are outdated. We're spending 30% more on fuel and tolls than our competitors. Just renegotiating that contract based on routes the drivers themselves suggest could save millions in a year." Richard stared at her, dumbfounded. "How do you know that?" "I empty the trash in the logistics manager's office," she said flatly. "And I talk to the drivers on the loading dock. They know how to save the company money, but nobody ever asked them. She turned back to Anthony Thompson, feeling the adrenaline take over. The grain supplier, Agro North. Their quality has dropped in the last 6 months. It's increasing the percentage of loss in processing. We're paying for gold and getting brass. A strict audit and sourcing new suppliers could increase our profit margin in a matter of weeks, she went on, her voice passionate, citing the problems she had mapped out in her notebook. From the waste of paper in the offices to the need to update the management software, which was causing delays and rework. She didn't use business jargon. She used the language of the reality she had experienced, naming employees, describing processes she had seen with her own eyes. She was no longer the spoiled daughter. She was a strategist who knew the battlefield from a trench no one else dared to visit. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Richard had sat down, his face pale, a mixture of shock, shame, and an undeniable glimmer of pride. Anthony Thompson stared at her, his lips a thin, tight line. He drummed his fingers on the desk for a long moment, the only sound in the room. "The ideas are sound," he said at last, "but ideas don't pay the bills. Execution is what generates profit, and frankly, your track record doesn't inspire confidence." The blow was harsh, but Julia took it. "I know. And I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for a chance. Not for me, for the company." It was then that Michael moved. He stepped away from the window and approached the desk, placing his hands on it. All eyes turned to him. "Dad," he said, his voice calm but full of authority, "we're not going to invest. We're going to take over." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "What are you proposing?" "We buy the company's debt from the creditors. Immediately. That gives them the cash flow to breathe and avoids the sale to the investment fund," Michael explained. "In exchange, we assume operational control, not 51% of the stock, but the decision-making power. We will implement these changes, all of them." He turned and looked directly at Julia, and it was then that he delivered the masterstroke, the most nerve-wracking moment of her life. "And she will be responsible for overseeing the implementation. She doesn't go back to the executive suite. She stays on the ground floor, but with the authority to make things happen, she will be the bridge between the factory floor and this office." Richard shot to his feet. "That's absurd. My daughter—" "Your daughter, Richard," Michael interrupted, his voice firm, "is the only person in this building who knows what's really wrong with it. This is the condition. She proves she can turn her words into results. In 6 months, we reevaluate. If she succeeds, the merger happens, we become partners, and you remain as CEO. If she fails—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication more terrifying than any threat. The fate of a billion-dollar empire, the future of her family and her own, was placed squarely on Julia's shoulders. It was no longer a test, it was the battlefield, and she had just been made the commander, to win or die trying. The next 6 months were a trial by fire. The news of Thompson Capital's intervention spread through the company like wildfire, sparking panic and uncertainty. Julia's appointment as Process Optimization Supervisor, a title created specifically for her that reported directly to Michael, was met with disbelief and, in many cases, open hostility. To the top-level executives, it was an affront. The former janitor, the exiled princess, now had the authority to question their methods and audit their departments. To the employees on the ground floor, there was suspicion. Was this just another game the rich were playing, an act they would put on before casting them aside? Julia found herself in a no-man's land, a general without an army. Her office was a small, glass-walled room on the mezzanine level, a fishbowl between the executive floor and the operations below. She no longer wore the grey uniform, but she didn't return to designer suits either. She adopted a simple, functional wardrobe that allowed her to move between both worlds. Her first days were brutal. Managers cancelled meetings, denied her access to reports, and treated her with condescending disdain. She faced closed doors and passive sabotage, but something inside her had changed. The humiliation had made her stronger, and the responsibility had given her an unshakable focus. She didn't back down. She started where she was strongest, on the ground floor. She spent her mornings on the loading docks, in the warehouses, in the cleaning stations, talking to the people she now knew by name. She listened to their frustrations, their ideas, their suggestions. With the help of Maria, who became her unexpected ally and a source of grassroots wisdom, she began implementing small changes that had an immediate impact on morale and efficiency. She organized the supply inventory, optimized the cleaning crew's schedules, and created a simple channel for employees to report maintenance issues. They were small victories, but they showed she was there to listen and solve problems, not to punish. Her next step was renegotiating the logistics contract. She scheduled a meeting with the directors of Translog. They arrived expecting to see Richard or a Thompson executive, but instead they found Julia, accompanied by two of the company's most experienced truck drivers. The directors' initial arrogance dissolved as the drivers, encouraged by Julia, spread out maps and detailed, with practical knowledge, the flaws in the current routes and proposed more efficient alternatives. By the end of the 2-hour meeting, Julia had not only secured a new contract with savings in the millions, but had also earned the respect of the men who had once seen her only as the boss's daughter. Michael was a constant but distant presence. He didn't interfere directly, but she knew he was watching her every move. He received daily reports on her progress, spoke with employees, and tracked the numbers. In their rare interactions, he was professional, demanding but fair. One evening, exhausted after a long battle to get an audit approved for the purchasing department, she found him in the parking lot. "They don't take me seriously," she vented, frustration clear in her voice. "To them, I'm still the spoiled girl they despise." Michael leaned against his truck and looked at her in the dim light. "Respect isn't given, Julia. It's earned. And you don't earn it with words, but with results. Keep showing them the numbers." Money speaks a language that even the most arrogant people understand. His words, though harsh, were the fuel she needed. She dove into the numbers, the reports, the processes. She worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a fierce determination to prove her worth. Slowly, the results began to show. The savings from logistics, the improvement in grain quality, the reduction in waste. It all started to be reflected on the company's balance sheet. The small cuts she had identified were being sutured one by one. The hostility from managers turned into reluctant cooperation, and eventually, cautious respect. They saw that her ideas worked. Her father, Richard, watched it all from his office, with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The daughter he had raised to be an heiress had become a leader, and he barely recognized her. The relationship between them was strained, formal. He watched her transform into the savior of the company he had almost lost, and it forced him to confront his own failings as a father. At the end of the 6 months, the company was transformed. The bleeding had stopped. Morale was higher, and there was a new sense of purpose and collaboration between the different levels of the company. Julia's arc of suffering was complete, not with a return to her former status, but with the forging of a new identity built on the respect she had learned to both give and receive. The final meeting was held in the same room at the Thompson Capital office. This time, when Julia walked in, the chair was not an indictment, but a place of honor. Anthony Thompson had the performance reports spread out on his desk. He studied them in silence for a long time. Then he looked up at Richard. "Your company is healthier and more profitable than it has ever been," he said. "Congratulations." He turned to Julia, and for the first time, she saw a gleam of admiration in his stern eyes. "And congratulations to you, young lady. You didn't just save your father's business. You transformed it." Then he pushed a folder across the desk toward Richard. "This is the merger agreement. The terms are as we discussed, our fortunes and our futures united. The resolution was complete. The primary conflicts had been resolved. Julia hadn't just saved the company, she had found herself. She had earned her place not through inheritance, but through merit. She looked at Michael, who gave her a small but genuine smile. A smile that was worth more than the entire net worth of their combined families. The signing of the merger was not celebrated with champagne and extravagant parties, as it would have been in the past. Instead, the celebration was a simple barbecue at the Thompson farm for all the employees of both companies. Amid the laughter, the country music, and the smell of grilling meat, Julia, dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, felt more at home than she ever had at the gala events of her previous life. She was no longer the center of attention, but an integral part of the whole, talking with the drivers about the new routes, with Maria's team about the new cleaning equipment, and with Michael's agronomists about the harvest. Richard watched her from a distance, talking with Anthony Thompson. There was a new lightness about her father, a peace she hadn't seen in years. He walked over to her, a plate of food in his hand. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am." It was the first time in a long time he had looked her in the eyes without the weight of disappointment. In that moment, the wound between them began to heal. He was no longer just the CEO, he was her dad again. Julia did not return to the executive suite. By mutual agreement, she took the title of Chief Operating Officer, keeping her office on the mezzanine, the bridge she had built between management and the factory floor. Her transformation was living proof that a company's greatest wealth was not in its financial assets, but in its human capital. Her relationship with Michael evolved slowly, built on a foundation of mutual respect. He was her boss, her mentor, and over time, her closest friend. They often ended their days walking through the company grounds, discussing ideas, sharing dreams not for the business, but for the people who comprised it. One afternoon, months after the merger, Michael invited her to visit a vacant lot the company had acquired. "What's the new investment?" she asked, curious. "Bitcoin? Tech stocks?" Michael laughed. "Something with a much higher return." He spread a blueprint across the hood of his truck. It was the plan for a daycare center and a job training facility for the employees, children, and spouses. "Our greatest asset is our people," he said, echoing her own thoughts. "We need to invest in them, in their families, in their future. That's what pays dividends for a lifetime." In that moment, looking at the project that promised a better future for so many, Julia understood the true nature of wealth. It wasn't in gold, dollars, or cryptocurrency. It was in human connection, in service, in the ability to use power and wealth to lift others up. Julia's journey, which began with a humiliating fall, had become an inspiring ascent. She lost an empire of luxury to find a kingdom of purpose. Her story became a quiet legend within the company, a lesson in how true strength lies not in privilege, but in the resilience of the human spirit. Years later, Thompson Sal's global agribusiness was a powerhouse on the international market, known not only for its profitability, but for its fair labor practices and community investment. And at its heart, two people, once separated by a chasm of class and prejudice, worked side by side, proving that the greatest inheritance one can leave is not a financial estate, but a legacy of dignity, respect, and hope. The girl who once kicked a lipstick to humiliate a man now built a